In many parts of the world, immigration has become a defining political issue. Taking a strong stance against it seems to be an increasingly surefire way to win votes.
The best example is the number one political issue of our time, the crisis of uncontrolled migration. It's uncontrolled. Your countries are being ruined.
But this episode isn't about the politics of immigration, it's about the economics. Critics say uncontrolled migration is overwhelming welfare systems, public finances, and housing markets. But its champions say that migration is the glue holding our economies together and the key to securing them into the future. We'll try to separate the facts from the fiction in a debate that has become increasingly heated. Welcome to Business Beyond. There are many different types of international migrants. There's economic migrants, refugees and asylum seekers, people who have been displaced by climate change and natural disasters, and people looking to join up with family members already overseas. International migrants are dispersed all around the world, but there are three global regions which attract more than anywhere else: Europe, North America and Oceania. As of 2024, 12.6% of Europe's population came from beyond its European borders, with the figure at almost 16% for North America. More than 20% of people in Oceania came from elsewhere. Europe has the highest total of migrants of any of the destinations we have mentioned. The total number has almost doubled in the past few decades, but many other regions have experienced even higher percentage increases in the same period. But part of the reason why migration has risen to the top of the political agenda is because over the last few years, applications for asylum, that's people seeking international protection, have increased dramatically. Asylum applications to OECD countries, which includes the EU27, the US, Canada and other wealthy economies, have been on an upward curve since the end of the pandemic. The number of new asylum seekers to OECD countries nearly doubled from 2021 to 2022 and grew by almost 25% in 2023. Another indicator is irregular migration. That's migration which has not been legally authorised. It may include people who eventually apply for asylum, but often not. Irregular migration into the EU surged in 2015 and 2016 and remained at relatively high levels until another sharp increase in 2023. However, recent data suggests it is on the decline. To understand more about recent migration patterns, we spoke to Amy Pope. She's the Director General of the United Nations International Organization for Migration. She says the present era is a particularly sensitive one for migration, not just in the West, but across the world.
The global narrative at this moment is that migration needs to be stopped, that borders need to be hardened, that we need to end effectively the movement of people and keep people where they are. And to a certain extent, there is truth to that argument. If a country does not have proper border management, if they don't have the proper legal systems to recruit labor when they need it, if they do not have a functioning asylum system that can quickly evaluate asylum claims, there will be a push of irregular migration. But on the flip side of that, we are seeing consistently through the evidence that migration is a driver of economic progress. It's a driver of innovation. It's a driver of support for aging communities.
It is a complex picture, and some political movements in Europe, the US, and elsewhere are tapping into concerns that some people have that too much migration is a problem for their economies. Many of the experts we spoke to say that there is a legitimate problem when governments do not have adequate policies to deal with large, sudden volumes of migration, particularly irregular migration.
When you have large movements of people that are being that are done through a kind of spontaneous system that is not going through a process, it does overwhelm communities and it does undermine public confidence in migration as a whole.
Michael Clements, an American economist who studies international migration and global economic development, agrees.
Sudden surges of immigration that are uncontrolled can obviously overwhelm public finances and existing public infrastructure for things like providing schooling. You can't expand teaching capacity at schools overnight, and if for some reason overnight the student population triples, that's going to be a major strain on any sort of community or any sort of system of public finances. So it would be wrong to suggest that it's not possible to overwhelm these things.
In their work, they both strongly emphasize the importance of migration to economies, and they also emphasize the importance of governments prioritizing migration policy. But first, let's take a closer look about whether some of the claims about migration's negative impact on host economies stack up. An increasingly common problem in Western economies is housing supply. Rents and house prices are rising rapidly, and many people are increasingly priced out. Germany's far-right AfD party, currently under investigation for right-wing extremism, has blamed migration, while in the US, Vice President J.D. Vance consistently blames migration for driving up house prices in the US and around the world. So is there a meaningful link between migration and rising house prices? To find out more, we spoke to Jacques Poot from New Zealand's University of Waikato. He has done extensive research on the link between immigration and housing markets.
So on the one hand, we've got immigration economics, which is a growing but complex topic. And on the other hand, we've got housing economics, which is on its own, even without thinking about immigration, also a pretty complex topic.
He says that one of the first major studies to explore how the issues were linked related to the Mariel boat lift. That was the mass emigration of Cubans to Miami in 1980, when around 125,000 Cubans moved to the US city over the space of a few months. The research was done by an economist called Albert Saiz.
He found that increased the population of Miami by something like 8% in say 4 or 5 months or so. And then he checked carefully what is the effect of that on house pricing in prices in Miami. And he found that the effect on house prices was about 8%. So it's almost 1-for-1. So you got a 1% increase in population. Due to migration, you get a 1% increase in prices.
The study garnered a lot of interest, and many similar ones followed. So Jacques and a colleague collated them all to establish if they could find a common link between housing markets and immigration.
Okay, if you put all these studies together, what do you get then? Well, you get quite a range of results, but the main result of size is still quite robust. So you're talking about a 1% increase in migrants in a country would increase prices by 1%.
So the common dynamic. If the population of an area increases by 1%, it will likely prompt a 1% increase in the prices of houses. But he emphasizes that migration is ultimately a small factor in a wide range, which influences property markets.
Take the case of Germany. So in the last decade, Germany had a 0.5% population growth per year for 10 years. And house prices went up over the last decade, 15 to 25, by 5% per year on average. So the immigration contribution to that change was only 1/10.
Interest rates, regulations, the nature of a country's construction sector, and inflation are just some of the factors which influence housing markets.
So there's a bunch of things that actually played a much bigger role than immigration in the increase in prices. So there is an effect, but it's actually, quantitatively relatively smaller than what many people think it is.
Another common criticism of a high rate of immigration into a Western economy is that it destabilizes the public finances. A regular complaint is that the cost of accepting migrants and attempting to integrate them, particularly asylum seekers and irregular migrants, is simply too high. There's no doubt that dealing with large volumes of asylum seekers and irregular migrants doesn't come cheap. Let's take Germany as an example. In 2024, Germany's federal government spent approximately 28 billion euros on refugee and asylum seeker costs, almost 6% of the total federal budget. But measuring the cost is not as simple as that. Because while in a given year the costs may be very high, benefits may also accrue over the longer term.
The point is that a lot of times what we hear in the public debate is very partial. We're talking just about the cost of immigration, but no, immigrants also contribute.
That's Damas de Matos, an economist with the OECD who has researched the long-term fiscal impact of migration into OECD countries such as the EU27 and the US. She says assessing the question is complex because of differences between migrants, those who move for work, those who move for family, and those who move for reasons of international protection.
What we know from country-specific studies, and there are countries where the data does exist so that we can make that difference between the different categories of migration, is that a humanitarian migrant will have a lower net fiscal contribution than the labor migrant, which is natural when you think about it, because if you come already with prearranged employment and you've chosen the country of destination and you're just going to start contributing as soon as you arrive, it's not the same than being forcibly displaced into a country.
In an OECD study Anna authored on the subject, she found that the overall fiscal impact was consistent.
In all countries, migrants are contributing more than what they receive. So that's a fact. Now, of course, then there are other expenditure of the state that we need to take into account. That's both for migrants and for the native-born infrastructure, transport, public lighting, security, and so on. When you take those into account, the net fiscal contribution of migrants is low. I mean, it's always bounded. It's between -1% and +1% of GDP. So even if you have a high share of humanitarian migrants, you're still within these bounds.
She says that even with asylum seekers and humanitarian migrants, the focus on short-term costs ignores the potential for long-term gains.
The debate tends to be centered on the cost. The cost is immediate, whereas the returns and the contributions of migrants are over time. And so this is, of course, initially, especially when we're talking about the humanitarian costs, there are costs that are, integration programs are costly, reception programs are costly, but a successful integration means that, it's another person who's going to be working and contributing to social security in the country.
That brings us to a key issue, the link between migration and employment. Successfully integrating migrants into a country's labour market is not just good for integration, it can reboot a country's economy and prepare it for future demographic turmoil. To consider this, we're going to take a closer look at a major global economy with a large migrant population, Germany. The EU's biggest country by population and by the size of its economy, Germany has a population of 83.6 million people, and of this 16.1 million are first-generation migrants, representing around 19% of the total population. Of Germany's population, 45.8 million were in employment as of August 2025. Like with the general population, migrants represent a big chunk of that total. In 2024, first-generation migrants represented 20.8% of those in employment. When we include all people classed as having a, quote, migration background, which includes the children of migrants, the percentage increases to 29%. More than any other country in Europe over the last decade, Germany has been caught up in a debate about migration. Back in 2015, in the middle of a major international refugee crisis, the then Chancellor Merkel famously declared Germany's ability to cope.
Ich sage ganz einfach, Deutschland ist ein starkes Land und das Motiv, in dem wir an diese Dinge herangehen, muss sein, wir haben so vieles geschafft, wir schaffen das. Wir schaffen das.
Germany's decision to take in over 1 million refugees transformed the country in many ways. But what about the economy? Here's the annual numbers of asylum applications made in Germany over the last 10 years. Record numbers were made during the refugee crisis before falling sharply. They rose again in 2022 and 2023 due to the war in Ukraine, but recent data suggests they're again on the decline. In the period after their arrival, asylum seekers' labour force participation was understandably low. It has improved significantly, but it still lags a long way behind the general population. Here we see the unemployment rate in Germany of people from 8 countries classified as asylum seeker countries of origin, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iraq, Iran, Syria, Eritrea, Somalia and Nigeria. It's measured against Germany's overall unemployment rate from 2015 to 2025. At the peak of the refugee crisis in 2016, the unemployment rate for those from the selected asylum-seeking countries in Germany soared past 50%. It's been on a downward trend since, but it has remained stubbornly high, with only a small decline since late 2019. It stands at just under 30% today. Over the last decade, Germany's overall unemployment rate has hovered around 5%. To understand more, we spoke to Susanne Schulz from the Bertelsmann Stiftung. She has extensively researched how migration has impacted Germany over the last 10 years. She says the gradual integration of refugees into the labour market has been impressive, but that the high cost of integration, combined with Germany's well-documented need for investment in its infrastructure, has created a mixed picture.
We now face a very ambivalent picture of migration and refugees in Germany, in the German debate, population, and also politics. We have a rise of the right-wing political party. So it's quite mixed, and we are now really facing a situation where we have to look at the basis of democracy, of cohesion, and how can we live together in a positive way.
Yet she emphasises how critical migrants are to boosting Germany's labour market, which is facing a major demographic challenge as its native population ages.
When you look at the numbers, you see that migration and refugees have brought a lot of positive things to Germany, particularly as regards the labor market and the economy. We couldn't be without. It would just not be possible. We are depending on migration. But this is not always clear in the heads of the people.
Panu Pudvara, director of the IFO Centre for Migration and Development Economics, agrees. But he also points to the mixed picture regarding the integration of refugees.
Germany would face severe labor shortages without immigration. Labor migration, both within the European Union and from outside, plays an important role in German economy. And work migrants make a clearly positive contribution. When it comes to refugee migration since 2015, the impact is mixed. Those refugees who are employed make a positive contribution and help to alleviate labor shortages, while of course those who are not employed are unfortunately a net burden on public finances.
But Germany's need for migrants to plug labour gaps is increasingly clear. This study illustrates 4 scenarios in Germany's labour market up to the year 2060, one without migration and the other 3 with varying levels. The result is clear. Without migration, Germany's labour market would collapse. Only with net migration of more than 350,000 people per year will it remain at current levels. But both experts caution that despite the success of migrants in Germany and the obvious need for them in the future, it's important that the government listens to concerns about the high costs of integration, about the need for infrastructure investment, and about services struggling to cope with demand.
Some communities are really struggling with the number of refugees and migrants they have in their community, above all because there is a lack of finances that they have, and there has been this lack of investment into the infrastructure. And this, I think, is something that definitely is to be taken serious, and there needs to be more investments made into infrastructure, into schooling, into housing, into streets, etc.
If it comes to work migration, then the overall effect is clearly positive. If it comes to integration of refugees, then it's hard to say. I think that most likely the overall net effect on public finances of refugee immigration is still negative, but it can of course be made positive if a labor force participation rates, especially of female refugees, can be increased.
We focused a lot on the apparent costs to a host economy of immigration. But the sum of our research and of most evidence on the topic points to overwhelming economic advantages. The USA, the world's biggest economy, is a good example. Throughout its history, migration has powered its economy, and for many, it remains a symbol of what migrants can achieve.
Immigration is at the center of economic growth in the United States. Something that few Americans realize is that the workforce of the United States would be collapsing without immigration, not at some future date of demographic change, but right now, today.
Michael Clemens says the demographic challenges faced by Germany are replicated in the US, and that immigration remains the only serious solution, despite the growing rhetoric and political action against it.
In the United States, we reject the idea that mass numbers of people from foreign lands can be permitted to travel halfway around the world, trample our borders, violate our sovereignty, cause unmitigated crime, and deplete our social safety net.
Right now, in 2025, the US workforce would be shrinking by 1 million workers per year, permanently lost without immigration. So that means that there may be some future world where AI renders labor irrelevant to economic growth. That's not the world we live in right now. There isn't a growing economy in the United States without a labor force, and our labor force would be collapsing without immigration.
He says economies like the US need migrants to fill vacancies of all kinds, not just high-skilled tech workers.
Silicon Valley in the United States runs on engineers, to be sure, but it also runs on childcare. It also runs on delivery workers. It runs on farm workers. It runs on construction workers. It runs on warehousing and security and many, many other things. All of those workers are necessary in order to produce the output of a modern economy.
There's another consideration: innovation. In an era where the European Union is in the midst of an existential crisis over its perceived lack of innovation, Michael Clemens says the US example highlights how immigration and innovation are linked.
Immigrants are crucial to innovation in the United States. A lot of people have noticed immigrants patenting new inventions or starting important firms. 46% of the 500 largest companies in America were founded by immigrants or their children.
It's true. 231 of the 500 largest US companies were founded by immigrants or their children, with 109, more than 20%, founded by first-generation immigrants. Of the 14 appearing for the first time this year, 71% were founded by immigrants. The successful entrepreneurism of immigrants is replicated across the OECD. In 2022, 17% of entrepreneurs in OECD countries were immigrants, up from 11% in 2006. In Europe, the US, and elsewhere, we are at an inflection point. Yet everyone we spoke to says the realities of a modern world increasingly impacted by climate change, conflict, and demographic transformation means that migration is going to increasingly define our societies.
At the moment, there are very few countries or economies of the world that are prepared to deal with what's coming. So that's the first point. The second is that we know the displacement pressures are increasing, certainly with differences in economic opportunity, certainly with the impact of a changing climate. Last year, more people were displaced by the impacts of climate. So it's effectively a perfect storm that is brewing.
It might not be politically popular. It may even be politically impossible in the current climate. But the world economy needs a collectively smarter policy on migration.
There's some uncertainty for the future. What we need is to have good migration management. So there's a lot of investment of countries, OECD countries in that sense, to make sure that the legal pathways that we're offering to migrants correspond to the needs of the labor market. That we are doing our best to integrate migrants who come from the different channels of migration and have different needs.
What needs to happen across the world is investment in migrant skills, because there's an enormous mismatch currently between the human capital, the education systems, the technical skills that migrants could potentially bring to destination countries and the skills that they have.
He points to the opportunity this presents and highlights the huge demographic transformation which is specifically happening in Africa as something which governments must wake up to.
Starting a couple of decades from now, the workforce of every region in the world will be falling except one, and that is Africa. There are going to be more and more workers in Africa, more and more young, energetic workers in Africa, a huge opportunity for a world where every other region and most of the advanced economies have rapidly shrinking labor forces.
Every country needs to have a hard look at its own labor market, at its own unemployment numbers, at its own wage structures, at its own skills. And this is not just in countries like Germany. Frankly, it's in countries like Senegal as well. There's just not yet an alignment around economic policy and migration policies that we think will be needed to ultimately create a system that works.
If the question that we asked at the start was, is migration important and beneficial for a developed economy? The answer is undoubtedly yes. But at the same time, the crises of the last few years have exposed problems in the system and shown how unprepared many governments are to properly handle migration.
Everything we see playing out, undermining of public confidence in governments, pressures on social systems, the pressures on wages, pressures on companies and their investment decisions. So we're hopeful that at some point we're going to start seeing this alignment between what's in the economic interest and migration policies that really make sense for countries.
In an era of division, the risks of not stepping up to the moment are significant.
That's a recipe for social unrest. It's a recipe for public dissatisfaction with what migration is. But migration doesn't have to be one thing. Policy can shape it. Policy can change it. Investment can make it better. Investment can make migration give destination countries more of what they want from it.
But if national governments can heed the genuine concerns of their populations while investing in policies which make the most of migration for all concerned, the potential for both economic success and social harmony is there. But time is not on their side.
If they want to manage what we know is coming in a much more controlled, much more strategic, much more economically beneficial and humane way, the time to act is now.
That's all from this episode. And if you're interested in learning about some of the topics that we discussed, I recommend that you look at our episode from earlier this year about how Africa's changing demographics could transform the global economy. Thanks a lot for watching, and until the next time, take care.